There is a question so old, so quietly vast, that simply sitting with it for a while tends to change something in the texture of ordinary thinking. It is not a question that demands an urgent answer. It is more like a question that rewards patient company. The kind of question you can carry with you the way you might carry a smooth stone in your pocket, occasionally turning it over in your fingers, feeling its weight, noticing how it catches the light differently at different hours of the day. The question is this: why is there something rather than nothing? On the surface, this might seem like a question asked only by philosophers in dusty rooms or by children lying on grass staring at the sky. But it is, in fact, one of the most fundamental inquiries available to human consciousness. Every other question we ever ask, about science, about history, about what to have for dinner, about whether we are loved, every single one of those questions already presupposes that there is something, that things exist, that the universe showed up at all. But why did it? Why does anything exist rather than a pure, featureless, absolute nothing? This is a question without an obvious answer, and that, strangely enough, is part of its beauty. It is a question that invites us into a particular kind of thinking, slow, receptive, contemplative, where the goal is not so much to arrive at a destination as to wander carefully through a very interesting landscape, noticing things along the way that we would otherwise rush past. The first thing worth noticing is how strange the question itself is. Most questions we ask are questions about something. We ask about the properties of things, the relationships between things, the histories and futures of things. But this question reaches behind all things and asks about the precondition of things. It asks, what is it about reality that makes reality exist at all? And it does so by contrast, by invoking the idea of nothing. Nothing as a concept is extraordinarily difficult to think about clearly. Every time we try to imagine nothing, we find ourselves imagining something. A dark space, an emptiness, a void. But a void is still something. A space, even an empty one, has structure and dimension. True nothing would have no space, no time, no structure of any kind, no laws of physics, no possibility, just the absolute absence of everything, including the absence of absence. The philosopher who is most famously associated with articulating this question in its modern form is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German polymath who lived from 1646 to 1716. Leibniz was a remarkable figure, a man of extraordinary intellectual range who made significant contributions to mathematics, inventing calculus independently of Isaac Newton, and who also thought very deeply about metaphysics, about the nature of God, about substance and identity. He was a careful, systematic thinker who had the unusual gift of being able to hold very large ideas with a kind of precise gentleness, as though even the most enormous concepts were things to be handled with attention and care. Leibniz posed the question, why is there something rather than nothing? In his 1714 work, known as The Principles of Nature and Grace, he wrote it simply and directly, and the simplicity of the phrasing is part of why it has echoed so powerfully through the centuries. He believed the question was the first question of metaphysics, the question that had to be answered before any other philosophical inquiry could really get underway. And his own answer to the question was rooted in his belief in God, specifically his belief that God exists as what he called a sufficient reason for the universe. The universe, for Leibniz, could not explain its own existence. Everything within the universe might have a cause within the universe, but the universe as a whole needed a reason outside itself, a foundation that was not itself in need of a foundation. And that foundation, for Leibniz, was a necessary being, a being whose existence requires no external explanation, because it exists, as philosophers say, necessarily. This idea of a necessary being is one that had roots long before Leibniz. Medieval philosophers like Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas had explored related ideas. Aquinas, in particular, had argued that if everything that exists is contingent, meaning it could have failed to exist, then at some point in the causal chain, there must be something that is not contingent, something whose existence is not borrowed from something else. He called this a being of pure actuality, something that does not depend on any prior cause because its very nature is to exist. What is lovely about these old arguments is not necessarily whether they are conclusive. Philosophers have debated them for centuries and continue to do so, but the way they draw attention to the sheer contingency of things. Contingency is a word that means, roughly, that something could have been otherwise. When we say that the world is contingent, we mean that there is nothing in the nature of reality that absolutely required it to be this way. The mountains and the oceans, the stars and the slow turning of galaxies, you and everything you have ever known, all of this bears the character of some things that might not have been. There is something fragile and remarkable about contingency, once you really let it settle into your awareness. The world feels, in a certain light, like a gift that was never strictly necessary, something given without obligation, present when it might just as easily have been absent. This sense of the gratuity of existence, the word gratuity here, meaning freely given, beyond what is owed, runs through a great deal of philosophical and religious thinking across many cultures. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a deep appreciation for the miraculous improbability of conscious existence. The image sometimes used is that of a blind sea turtle swimming in an ocean, surfacing for air once every 1,000 years, and the likelihood that when it surfaces, its head would pass through a single ring floating somewhere on the surface of that ocean. This image is offered as a way of pointing toward the extraordinary improbability of finding oneself alive and aware at all. It is not meant to create anxiety about that improbability, but rather to cultivate a quiet wonder at it, a sense of the preciousness and astonishing particularity of existence. Leibniz's question remained a central concern of metaphysics through the centuries after him, though it was sometimes approached from very different directions. The Scottish philosopher David Hume, who lived in the 18th century, was deeply skeptical of any argument that tried to prove the existence of a necessary being. Hume questioned whether the idea of necessity could be applied to existence at all. For Hume, necessity was a feature of logical relationships. The relationship between a triangle and the property of having three sides, for instance, is necessary in the sense that a three-sided figure that lacked three sides would be a contradiction. But existence, Hume argued, is different. To say that something necessarily exists is to make a claim that Hume found deeply problematic, because he could not find any logical contradiction in imagining the non-existence of any being, including God. Whatever we can conceive of as existing, Hume thought, we can also conceive of as not existing, without thereby contradicting ourselves. Hume's skepticism opened a kind of philosophical space, a space of genuine uncertainty about whether the question of why there is something, rather than nothing, could ever receive a fully satisfying answer. And this space was one that later thinkers inhabited in various ways. Some found in it a reason for humility, an acknowledgement that the deepest questions about reality might lie beyond the reach of human reason. Others found in it a reason for wonder. If there is no necessary reason for existence, then existence is even more astonishing, even more of an open, gratuitous fact about the world. Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century German philosopher, approached the question with characteristic care and thoroughness. Kant was convinced that human reason had genuine limits, not limits that should cause despair, but limits that were important to understand clearly. He argued that questions about the ultimate origin of the universe, about whether the cosmos had a beginning in time or extended infinitely into the past, about whether there was a first cause or whether the chain of causes stretched back without end. These were questions that reason could approach from both sides with equal force. We could construct seemingly valid arguments both for and against the idea that the universe had a beginning. We could construct seemingly valid arguments both for and against the idea of a necessary being. And the fact that reason could go in both directions, Kant thought, suggested that these questions lay in a territory that exceeded what our minds were built to resolve. He called these antimonies, places where reason meets its own reflection and cannot progress further. This is not a discouraging conclusion, if we hold it gently enough. Kant was not saying that the questions were meaningless or foolish. He was saying that they point towards something that our ordinary conceptual tools, the tools that work so well for everyday empirical inquiry, are not quite the right shape for. There is something humbling and, in its own way, restful about this. It suggests that the question of existence is not one that is waiting to be solved in the way a mathematical problem is waiting to be solved. It is, perhaps, more like a horizon, always present, always significant, always pulling our attention gently outward, but not something we are meant to reach and stand upon. And yet, the question keeps returning. Generation after generation, cultures across the world and traditions across the centuries have found themselves drawn back to this same deep wondering. Why anything at all? Why this, all of this? The whole improbable abundance of a universe. In the 20th century, the philosopher who engaged with this question most directly and most memorably was Martin Heidegger, one of the most complex and original thinkers of the modern era. Heidegger was a German philosopher who lived from 1889 to 1976, and he believed that Western philosophy had, for most of its history, forgotten something essential. It had forgotten, he said, the question of being. Not the question of beings, particular things that exist, but being itself, the sheer isness of things, the fact that things are rather than are not. Heidegger thought this forgetting was not accidental, but deeply embedded in the way that modern Western thought had developed. We had become so focused on things, on manipulating them, categorizing them, measuring them, producing and consuming them, that we had lost our attunement to being. We had stopped being struck by the fact that there is a world at all. We moved through existence, Heidegger suggested, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world, as though reality were simply there by default, as though its presence needed no acknowledgement and inspired no wonder. To recover the question of being, Heidegger believed, was to begin recovering something essential about human existence. He thought that the capacity to be struck by the strangeness of existence, by the fact that there is something rather than nothing, was not just a philosophical curiosity, but a fundamental dimension of what he called authentic human life. To live without that attunement, he suggested, was to live in a kind of forgetfulness, moving through a world whose depths one never really touched. Heidegger's style of writing is notoriously difficult, and there is no need here to follow him into all its intricacies. But the core of what he was pointing toward is not, at its heart, so hard to grasp, because it corresponds to something that most people have felt at least once, often in moments of stillness, or at the edges of sleep, or when looking at something in nature for long enough that the ordinary familiarity of it falls away and something stranger and more luminous appears in its place. There are moments when the sheer fact of existence appears with unusual clarity, when a tree looks more like a tree than it usually does, when the night sky seems to open into its own immensity in a way that is almost too much to hold, when a conversation pauses, and in the silence, one suddenly has the peculiar sense of having been handed something that cannot quite be named. These moments, Heidegger thought, were glimpses of being, not mystical hallucinations, but genuine recognitions of somethings that is always present, but usually hidden behind the busy surface of ordinary life. Heidegger returned again and again to what he called the fundamental question of metaphysics, which was Leibniz's question. Why is there something rather than nothing? He believed it was not just a question for academic philosophy, but a question that, if genuinely asked, really asked, not just repeated as a formula, could shake a person loose from the comfortable habituation of their ordinary assumptions and open them to something essential about the nature of reality. He thought the question only really began to work on a person when it was asked in full seriousness, and that asking it in full seriousness was not something one could do casually. It required a certain willingness to pause, to let the ground of the ordinary give way a little, to stand without the reassurance of the usual. There is something meditative in this, and not coincidentally so. Various philosophical and contemplative traditions have noticed that this question, why anything at all, tends to arise most naturally in states of quietude and attentiveness. The mystic Meister Eckhart, a medieval German theologian and philosopher, spoke of a ground of the soul, a depth of consciousness that lay beneath ordinary thoughts and feelings, and in which something of the deepest nature of reality could be glimpsed. He spoke of God as the ground of all being, not as a being among other beings, but as the condition of possibility for any being at all. And he spoke of a kind of knowing that was not the usual analytical knowing, but something more receptive, more open, a knowing that was really a kind of unknowing, a willingness to release the grip of the conceptual and to simply rest in what is. This kind of wisdom, the wisdom of resting in what is, appears in many traditions, though it is expressed in very different languages and frameworks. In Taoism, the Great Way, the Tao, is understood not as a being, but as something prior to all distinction, prior to the division of things into this and that. The opening lines of the Tao Te Ching say, in various translations, something like, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." What this points toward is the idea that the deepest ground of reality is not something that can be captured in concepts or names, because concepts and names are things that arise within reality. They are features of the world of distinctions, and the deepest ground of reality lies before distinctions. Why there is something rather than nothing might be, from this perspective, a question that cannot be answered in the usual way, not because it is unanswerable in principle, but because the answer is not a piece of information, but a kind of presence, something one participates in, rather than something one describes from outside. These resonances between philosophy and contemplative practice are worth holding gently in mind as we continue. They suggest that the question of existence is not only an intellectual puzzle, but something that touches on how we inhabit our own awareness, how we relate to the simple fact of being here, being conscious, finding ourselves in the middle of an improbable world. Modern analytic philosophy has approached the question of why there is something rather than nothing, with a characteristically different style, more formal, more concerned with precise definitions and logical entailments, less interested in phenomenological description or poetic resonance. And yet the question has proven just as difficult to resolve in this mode as in any other, which is itself rather telling. One influential contemporary approach was developed by the philosopher Derek Parfit, who died in 2017 and was widely regarded as one of the most original metaphysicians of his era. Parfit was deeply interested in questions about personal identity, about ethics, and about the nature of reality. In his later work, particularly in his essay, Why Anything? Why This? Parfit explored several possible answers to the fundamental question of existence, and he found all of them deeply puzzling in ways that he was honest and careful about acknowledging. Parfit considered what he called the null hypothesis, the idea that the simplest possible reality would be no reality at all, that nothingness would be the default, and that the existence of something always required explanation. He was struck by the fact that if we think of all possible realities, all the possible ways a universe or universes could be, the vast majority of them would involve something. Pure nothingness is only one possibility among an infinite number of possibilities, and perhaps a rather special and unusual one. This prompted Parfit to wonder whether, in some sense, the existence of something might be more expectable than the existence of nothing, whether the bias toward something might itself be a feature of the landscape of possibilities. Parfit also explored what he called selector principles, principles that might explain why, among all possible universes, the actual universe is the one that exists. He considered the possibility that there is a principle of plenitude, that all possible universes exist, which is an idea associated with various philosophical traditions and has been revisited in modern cosmology in the form of the multiverse hypothesis. If all possible universes exist, then the question of why this universe exists has a simple answer. It exists because every possible universe exists. But this only pushes the question back a step. Why do all possible universes exist, rather than none? And it raises the further question of what it means for a possible universe to exist. Where or how all these universes are supposed to be real. This is one of the interesting features of the question of existence. It has a way of absorbing every proposed answer and returning it with a new question. Whatever we propose as the explanation for existence tends to be itself something that exists, and therefore something whose existence itself requires explanation. The only way to stop this regress is to posit something that does not require explanation, something necessary, something self-explanatory, something that carries its own reason for being within itself. And this, of course, is where Leibniz began, and where Aquinas began, and where every cosmological argument for the existence of God eventually arrives. Whether that destination is satisfying depends a great deal on one's prior philosophical and theological commitments, and also on how one understands what it would mean for anything to be truly necessary. The philosopher David Lewis, another 20th century American analytic philosopher, took the plenitude idea very seriously and developed it into what he called modal realism, the view that all logically possible worlds are equally real. For Lewis, when we say that something is possible, that things could have been different, we are not just speaking hypothetically or metaphorically. We are making a claim about the actual existence of concrete possible worlds, just as real as our own, differing from ours in some way or another. There are worlds where the dinosaurs were not struck by an asteroid, worlds where different stars formed around different planets, worlds where the laws of physics themselves are subtly or profoundly different. All of these worlds, for Lewis, genuinely exist. Ours is simply one of them. Modal realism is a view that most people find initially startling and many philosophers find ultimately unpersuasive, but it has a certain kind of inner consistency that rewards patient examination. And it does offer one response to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. If all possible worlds exist, then there is simply no room for nothingness. Nothingness is not a possible world, or if it is, it exists alongside all the others, which means it is not true nothingness, but just one more possibility in an infinite landscape of possibilities. The something of our experience is not in need of special explanation, because its existence follows from the existence of everything. But there is something vertiginous about this view, and perhaps something that is too neat. It trades the mystery of one universe for the mystery of infinitely many, and it does not really dissolve the question of existence so much as multiply it. Why do all possible worlds exist? What is the ground of their reality? What makes possibility real rather than merely notional? These questions do not go away. They simply take on a larger scale. The physicist Lawrence Krauss wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing, in which he argued that modern physics provides an answer to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. The answer, roughly, is that quantum mechanics permits the spontaneous emergence of particles and fields from what physicists call the quantum vacuum, a state that, while often called empty space, is not truly empty, but seething with potential, with virtual particles flickering in and out of existence, with energy that is intrinsic to the fabric of space-time itself. From this quantum vacuum, Krauss argued, a universe like ours could emerge without the need for any external cause or creator. The response to this argument from many philosophers was that while it was genuinely interesting and scientifically illuminating, it did not quite answer the metaphysical question. What Krauss described was not nothingness, but a very particular something, a quantum vacuum with specific properties, governed by specific laws of physics, embedded in a mathematical structure of remarkable complexity. The philosopher David Albert, reviewing Krauss's book, made this point with characteristic clarity. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is a question about why there are any laws of physics at all, any quantum fields, any structure of any kind. Even the most minimal physical substrate, even the quantum vacuum, is something rather than nothing, and its existence is not less puzzling for being very small or very simple. The question, in other words, reaches beneath physics, beneath the natural sciences, into a territory where our usual empirical tools cannot follow. This is an important point, and it is worth dwelling on. One of the things that makes the question of why there is something rather than nothing genuinely philosophical, rather than merely scientific, is that it cannot be answered by pointing to something else that exists. Any answer that says, essentially, this exists because of that, merely relocates the mystery. It does not dissolve it. The question does not ask for a causal explanation within the world, but for an explanation of why there is a world at all, why there is any causal framework, any structure of law, any arena in which causes and effects can operate. This does not mean science is irrelevant to the question. It means that science and metaphysics are asking different kinds of questions, and that the question of existence in its deepest form is one that science opens toward, but cannot close. There is something beautiful about this division of labor. The empirical and the metaphysical are not in competition, but in complementarity, each illuminating aspects of reality that the other cannot fully reach. The philosopher of science Karl Popper once said that he found the existence of the world, any world, however simple, a permanent and inexhaustible source of wonder, not as a problem demanding a solution, but as a fact that deserved to be looked at directly and honestly, without pretending it was obvious or without trying too hard to make it go away by dissolving it into something else. There is a kind of intellectual honesty in that position. It neither demands an answer that may not be available, nor dismisses the question as meaningless. It simply holds the question open, as a permanent condition of thoughtful existence. The question of why there is something rather than nothing also opens naturally into questions about the nature of nothingness itself, and these questions are stranger and more subtle than they might at first appear. The intuitive idea of nothing, the absence of everything, turns out to be philosophically unstable. When we try to think about absolute nothingness, we almost immediately run into difficulties. Can nothingness have properties? Can it have a duration? Can it be the kind of thing that gives rise to something else? These questions suggest that nothingness is not a neutral, passive baseline that simply persists until something disturbs it. Nothingness is not a container waiting to be filled. It is, if we try to think it through carefully, something so radical that it is genuinely difficult to conceive. The philosopher Jim Holt, who wrote a remarkable book called Why Does the World Exist?, traveled the world speaking with philosophers, cosmologists, and theologians about this question, and he found that even the most sophisticated thinkers were left in the end with a residue of mystery they could not eliminate. Holt himself, writing with warmth and intellectual honesty, concluded that the question was perhaps the one question that could never be fully answered, not because of any limitation of human intelligence, but because any complete answer would itself need to be grounded in something, and that something would be part of existence, not its explanation. There is something consoling in this, though perhaps not at first. If the question of existence is genuinely unanswerable, if it is not a puzzle waiting for the right key, but a permanent feature of the universe's relation to itself, then we are released from the pressure of needing to solve it. We can simply live with the question. We can carry it the way one carries a deep curiosity about a beautiful place one has never visited, not with frustration at not having been there, but with a gentle and ongoing appreciation of the fact that such a place exists and is worth wondering about. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, in his Letters to a Young Poet, gave advice that is not strictly philosophical, but resonates deeply with this spirit. He wrote that one should try to love the questions themselves, not seek the answers which cannot be given, because one would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps, gradually, without noticing it, one will live one's way into the answer. This is not a prescription for intellectual laziness, but for a particular kind of patience. The patience of someone who understands that some of the most important things are approached slowly, sideways, through living rather than through solving. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is, in this sense, a companion for a whole life. It does not demand resolution in an evening. It asks only to be held with some care and to be returned to occasionally. In the quiet moments, in the pauses between activities, in the early morning light or the late evening dark, when the surface of things is less busy and something deeper is more accessible. One of the interesting features of the question, which is worth noticing, is how it changes depending on what we take to be the alternative. The question asks, why something rather than nothing? But this framing assumes that nothing is the simpler alternative, the more natural state, the default. Is that assumption correct? It is not obvious that it is. Nothingness, if we think about it carefully, is a very specific and demanding condition. It requires the absence of everything, not just the absence of matter and energy, but the absence of space, of time, of laws, of mathematical structure, of possibility itself. That is a remarkably precise and particular condition. It is not clear why we should think of it as simpler than having something. Perhaps the existence of something is, in fact, more natural than the existence of nothing. If by natural we mean something like less arbitrary, less precisely constrained. This thought has been pursued by various philosophers, including the contemporary philosopher of physics, Max Tegmark, who has argued that mathematical structures are not invented by human minds, but are discovered, that they exist independently of any physical instantiation, and that the physical world we inhabit is itself a mathematical structure. If all mathematical structures exist, and if existence is simply what it means for a mathematical structure to be realized, then existence is the rule rather than the exception. The question would then not be why there is something rather than nothing, but why we find ourselves in this particular mathematical structure rather than another, which is a different and perhaps more tractable question. Tegmark's view, like Lewis's modal realism, is one that not everyone finds compelling, but it illustrates a persistent pattern in how philosophers and physicists have tried to approach the question of existence. The pattern is to try to make existence less puzzling by making it more inevitable, by arguing that the existence of something, whether a set of all possible worlds, or all mathematical structures, or a necessary being, follows from something even more fundamental than existence. The challenge is always to explain what that more fundamental thing is without simply reintroducing the original mystery in a new form. Perhaps the most honest response to the question is one that holds several thoughts together at once. That the question is genuinely profound and not trivially answerable. That various traditions, philosophical, scientific, religious, contemplative, illuminate different facets of it without exhausting it, and that there is something fitting about a universe that remains, at its foundations, somewhat mysterious to the creatures it has produced to wonder about it. We are, in a sense, the universe looking at itself. Concentrations of matter and energy and biological complexity that have become organized enough to ask questions about their own existence. That this should be possible, that the universe should have produced beings capable of wondering about it, is itself astonishing and perhaps the most vivid illustration available of the strangeness and richness of the fact that there is something rather than nothing. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, writing in his book Mind and Cosmos, explored the deeply puzzling relationship between consciousness and the physical world. Nagel was troubled by the apparent inability of standard materialist accounts to explain how and why there should be subjective experience at all, why it is that the physical processes of the brain should be accompanied by an inner life, a felt quality of experience, a first-person perspective. He was not advocating for any kind of supernatural explanation, but he was insisting that the existence of mind was at least as puzzling as the existence of the physical world, and possibly more so. If we find it remarkable that there is a universe at all, how much more remarkable is it that there is a universe that knows itself, that some portion of it is awake to its own existence, capable of wonder, capable of sitting quietly at night and asking why anything exists at all? This is the question that circles back always to the one doing the questioning. For the question of why there is something rather than nothing is not an abstract puzzle entirely disconnected from the one who asks it. The asker is part of the something. The question arises from within the something, from within the extraordinary fact of existence, and is directed outward, or rather inward, toward the root of that fact. There is a kind of paradox here. We cannot step outside existence to ask whether it was necessary. We are immersed in it, constituted by it. Our very capacity to pose the question depends on the existence whose grounds we are questioning. And yet the question does not feel frivolous or circular. It feels important, and it feels important precisely because we are inside it. Because we are not merely thinking about existence abstractly, but living it, moment to moment, breath to breath. Some philosophers have found in this paradox a clue. The phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, founder of the philosophical movement that Heidegger later developed and transformed, was deeply interested in consciousness itself as the bedrock of all philosophical inquiry. For Husserl, the starting point of philosophy was not the world of external things, but the field of conscious experience. What he called the life world, the world as it is given to us in experience, before any theoretical abstractions are applied to it. Husserl thought that by attending very carefully to the structure of experience, to the way things appear in consciousness, to the relationship between the act of experiencing and the thing experienced, we could uncover insights that purely external third-person inquiry could not reach. There is something in this that resonates with the question we have been carrying. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is, in one of its dimensions, a question about why there is experience at all. It is a question about why there is a world for someone, a world that shows up in awareness, a world that is given rather than merely there. And attending to experience itself, to the simple fact of being here, in awareness with all of this, is perhaps one of the most direct ways to be with the question, even if it is not a way of answering it. Phenomenology, as a philosophical method, involves a kind of careful attentiveness to what is simply given, before interpretation, before theory, before all the overlays of habit and assumption that usually mediate our relationship with the world. It involves, in a sense, learning to see freshly, and it is interesting that this philosophical method, developed in rigorous academic contexts by thinkers like Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, arrives at something that resembles what contemplative traditions have valued in their own ways: the capacity to be present to what is, without the usual screen of preconception and habit. The philosopher-monk Thomas Merton wrote that the most important thing is to look at what is in front of one, not with the analytical eye that immediately categorizes and judges, but with a simpler, more open kind of looking, the kind that precedes judgment and simply receives. This might sound passive, but it is in fact a demanding practice. We are so accustomed to filtering our experience through the lens of what we expect, what we want, what we already believe, that simply looking, simply letting what is there appear on its own terms, takes considerable attention and care. The question of why there is something rather than nothings asks, in one of its dimensions, that we look at the something that is there, that we let its being register, rather than taking it for granted. And taking it for granted is so easy and so natural. The world shows up for us so reliably, so consistently, with such familiar features that we almost never stop to notice the sheer improbability of its showing up at all. The fact that there is a world is, from the inside of ordinary experience, invisible, hidden by the very density and richness of the world itself. Wittgenstein, one of the most distinctive philosophical voices of the 20th century, said something remarkable in his early work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He said, "Not how the world is the mystical, but that it is." This single sentence contains a great deal. Wittgenstein was not, in his early work, a mystical thinker in the usual sense. He was interested in logic, in the structure of language, in the limits of what could be said. But he recognized that the fact of the world, its sheer existence, was something that lay at the edge of what language could express. Logic and language could describe features of the world, relationships between things in the world, but the existence of the world as a whole was not a feature of the world. It was not something that could be said within the world's own system of description. It was, in this sense, something that showed itself without being sayable, something that had to be met in a different way than ordinary descriptions meet ordinary things. This is a thought that rewards slow attention. The mystical, for Wittgenstein, and he used that word deliberately and carefully, is not some exotic state of consciousness or some supernatural phenomenon. It is the plain fact of existence. It is that the world is rather than the how. And it is mystical precisely because it lies at the limit of what language can encompass, at the point where our usual tools for making sense of things reach the edge of their range. There is a way of reading Wittgenstein's thought here that is deeply compatible with the spirit of contemplative practice, even though Wittgenstein was not primarily a contemplative philosopher. Both Wittgenstein and the contemplative traditions are pointing toward a kind of knowing, or perhaps a kind of being, that goes beyond what words and concepts can fully capture. They are pointing toward an encounter with the simply given, the irreducibly present, the fact of existence before all interpretation. In the later decades of the 20th century and into the 21st, the question of why there is something rather than nothing has continued to attract philosophical attention of remarkable depth and variety. The philosopher John Leslie, for instance, developed what he called the axiarchic view, the idea that value is the key to existence, that reality exists because its existing is good. This is a view that draws on a very long tradition, going back to Plato's idea that the good is the highest principle of reality, even higher than being itself. The thought is that value is not something imposed on a pre-existing neutral reality, but is in some sense prior, that reality exists because it is good that it should, or because existence is better than non-existence in some fundamental and non-circular sense. Leslie's view is not widely accepted, but it touches something real, the intuition that existence has a kind of positive character, that there is something affirmative about the fact that things are. This intuition runs through a great deal of religious and philosophical thinking about existence. It is there in the medieval philosopher's idea of being as convertible with goodness. The idea that to exist is, in some sense, to be good, and that perfect being would be perfect goodness. It is there in the mystical tradition's idea of God as the one whose essence is to exist, the pure act of being that underlies and supports all particular beings. Whether or not one finds these theological frameworks persuasive, they point toward something worth holding, that existence is not a neutral or indifferent fact, but one that has, in some dimension, a positive character. The world is not nothing, and the not-nothingness of the world, its being here, its being real, its being available to experience and reflection and wonder, is not something we are forced to be indifferent about. We can, if we choose, receive it with something like gratitude, even in the absence of a clear account of who or what the gratitude might be directed toward. The philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch wrote beautifully about attention as a moral and metaphysical practice. For Murdoch, the capacity to really see things, to look at them clearly, without distortion by our own desires and fears and preconceptions, was the foundation of ethical life and also a kind of wisdom about reality. She drew on Plato's image of the good as the sun, the principle that makes everything visible, without itself being one of the things we see. And she developed an account of love and art and moral life in which the capacity to be present to what is real, rather than to what we wish or fear reality to be, was the central virtue. There is, in Murdoch's thinking, a deep connection between the question of existence and the quality of our attention. To be more fully present to the fact that things exist, to really look at a face, a tree, a piece of music, the night sky, is, in her view, a form of philosophical and moral development, a movement toward a more genuine engagement with reality. This connection between the question of existence and the quality of our attention is one worth sitting with. It suggests that the question of why there is something rather than nothing is not merely an abstract puzzle for specialists, but a question that has a practical dimension, a dimension that touches on how we inhabit our own experience, how we relate to the world and to other people, how present and awake we are to the simple fact of being here. To ask the question with full seriousness is to be struck, even briefly, by the improbability and the richness of existence. And to be struck by that is to be moved, to be touched by something that is always there, but usually too familiar to notice. The philosopher Albert Camus approached the question of existence from a very different angle than Leibniz or Heidegger, but his approach is worth including here because it captures something important about the relationship between existence and meaning. Camus was interested in what he called the absurd, the tension between the human desire for clarity and meaning and the world's refusal to provide them on demand. He did not pose the question of why there is something rather than nothing as a metaphysical puzzle, so much as an existential one. His question was more like, given that we exist, given that we are here in this strange and often opaque world, what do we make of it? What does it mean to be a conscious being in a universe that does not speak our language, that does not arrange itself according to our expectations? That simply is. Camus was not a nihilist, despite sometimes being characterized as one. He did not believe that the absence of cosmic guarantees meant that life was meaningless or that the world was something to be endured rather than engaged. He believed, on the contrary, that the honest confrontation with the absurd, the honest acknowledgement of the gap between what we want and what the universe provides, could be a foundation for genuine life, for rebellion in the sense of persistent and passionate engagement with experience rather than withdrawal or despair. There is something defiant in Camus's vision, but also something warm and affirmative, a refusal to let the mystery of existence become a reason for disengagement. The question of why there is something rather than nothing has a way of touching on all these dimensions: the logical, the metaphysical, the phenomenological, the ethical, the contemplative. It is a question that does not stay neatly in one domain. Pull on the thread of existence, and you find it connected to threads of consciousness, value, attention, meaning, language, and the quality of how one lives. This interconnectedness is part of what makes the question so rich, and part of why engaging with it, even slowly and incompletely, tends to leave one feeling that one has touched something real about the texture of being alive. The astronomer and philosopher Carl Sagan, who had a remarkable gift for communicating the scale and strangeness of the cosmos to a wide audience, often circled around questions related to this one. He was not a metaphysician in the technical sense, but he was deeply attentive to what he called the pale blue dot. The Earth, as seen from billions of miles away, a tiny speck of light in an immense darkness. What struck Sagan about that image was not a sense of meaninglessness, but almost the opposite, a sense of the preciousness and improbability of the world we inhabit, a sense of the extraordinary good fortune of having a planet capable of producing the complex chemistry of life, and then of producing beings complex enough to turn around and look at themselves and their universe with wonder. Sagan was a naturalist. He believed in a universe governed by natural laws without the need for supernatural agency. But his naturalism was not a disenchanted naturalism. It was one that found in the very laws of nature, in the very improbability of existence, an occasion for something very much like awe. Awe is an interesting concept to bring into this conversation. The philosopher Dasha Keltner has studied awe empirically as a psychological and physiological phenomenon, and he has found that it tends to arise when we encounter something that is both vast and difficult to assimilate into our existing frameworks of understanding. The experience of awe involves a kind of accommodation, a stretching of our usual categories to make room for something that exceeds them. And the question of why there is something rather than nothing is perhaps, in this sense, the most naturally awe-inducing question available to us. It points toward the vastest possible thing, the totality of existence, and it asks a question about it that our usual framework simply cannot assimilate. The result, if we are willing to stay with it, is a kind of productive disorientation, a loosening of the certainties that ordinarily structure our sense of the world, and an opening into something that is genuinely larger than our ordinary self-concern. It is worth noting that this experience, this encounter with the vastness and strangeness of existence, does not typically produce despair or anxiety, at least as not when it is approached with the kind of openness and patience that philosophical contemplation cultivates. More often, it produces something closer to peace. There is something in the recognition that the universe is enormously larger and more mysterious than our individual concerns that tends to relativize those concerns in a healthy way. Not to dismiss them, individual concerns are real and matter, but to place them in a context that is so large that the urgency and the weight of ordinary preoccupations become somewhat lighter, somewhat less oppressive. The question of existence has a way of doing this. It holds everything else at a slight distance, in the best sense. Not cold distance, but the distance of perspective. The distance that allows us to see more clearly, because we are not pressed so close to any one thing that it fills our entire field of vision. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome had a practice they called the view from above, the exercise of imagining oneself rising high enough to see the whole of human affairs from a great distance in order to gain a perspective on the particular anxieties and ambitions of ordinary life. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and philosopher who kept a private journal of philosophical reflections, now known as the Meditations, returned to this practice repeatedly. He would remind himself of the immensity of time, of the vast stretches of history before and after his own brief moment, of the physical vastness of the cosmos compared to the small parcel of it that any one life occupies. He did this not to depress himself, but to free himself, to loosen the grip of what was transient and particular, so that something more essential could breathe. The question of why there is something rather than nothing operates, in a quieter way, by a similar logic. It invites a kind of expansion, a momentary release from the grip of what is immediately pressing into something that is so large and so foundational that all the immediately pressing things become slightly smaller, slightly more manageable by comparison. One of the things that makes this question uniquely suited to quiet, unhurried contemplation is that it cannot be thought about at speed. Practical questions can be solved quickly. Factual questions can be answered quickly. But this question resists speed the way certain kinds of beauty resist hurry. The beauty of a long view across open landscape, or the beauty of music that unfolds slowly and requires patience to reveal its full architecture. The question of existence is one that unfolds if we give it time. It opens out in different directions depending on what we bring to it. Our philosophical background, our personal history, our religious commitments, or lack of them, our current state of mind. But it opens most fully when approached with the willingness to simply be with it, without demanding a resolution. There is also something deeply communal about this question, even though it is so often posed in solitude. To ask why there is something rather than nothing is to join a conversation that has been going on for as long as human beings have been capable of wonder. Leibniz asked it in the 18th century. Heidegger asked it in the 20th. The medieval philosophers asked it in the language of Latin scholasticism. The ancient Greeks asked it in the language of logos and physis. The authors of the Upanishads asked it in the language of Brahman and Atman, of the infinite and the individual, of the one reality that underlies all its particular manifestations. The Confucian tradition asked it in terms of the relationship between heaven and earth, between the underlying pattern of things and its particular expressions. These are very different languages, very different conceptual frameworks, but they are all reaching toward the same vast, quiet question. To be part of that conversation is, in some small way, to be part of the long, human effort to be honest about what it is to exist, to refuse the temptation of taking it for granted, to insist on being at least occasionally surprised by the sheer fact of being here. There is a kind of solidarity in this, a recognition that the deepest questions belong to everyone, that no tradition or discipline owns them, that they arise wherever human beings are willing to pause and look up from the surface of things and ask what lies beneath. The physicist Freeman Dyson, speaking near the end of his long life, said that he found the universe to be not only far stranger than we supposed, but far stranger than we could suppose, and that this was, for him, a source of profound satisfaction rather than frustration. The strangeness was a sign of depth. A universe that could be fully explained in terms of human understanding would be a much less interesting universe than the one we actually inhabit. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is, in this sense, a gift from the universe to its inhabitants, a sign that reality exceeds our grasp in ways that are not threatening, but enriching, not limiting, but liberating. The philosopher of science, Karl Jaspers, spoke of what he called limit situations, moments in human life when we encounter the boundaries of our usual frameworks, when existence shows its unfamiliar face, when ordinary certainties give way, and we are left in contact with something more fundamental than our everyday habits of mind. These moments could be painful. They often were. But they were also, for Jaspers, occasions for what he called existenz, for the deepening and authenticating of human existence that comes from being genuinely confronted with its conditions and its limits. The question of why there is something rather than nothing is, in a quiet and unhurried way, a limit situation, a place where the mind reaches its edge and encounters something that will not resolve into ordinary categories. And this, perhaps, is what makes it so suitable for the quiet hours, for the spaces between the demands of the day, when the mind can afford to wander without urgency, when the ordinary pressure of practicality is somewhat lifted and something more contemplative can emerge. The question does not demand alertness in the aggressive sense. It does not require readiness for action. It asks only for a certain quality of receptive attention, the kind of attention that arises naturally in stillness, that does not impose itself on what it encounters, but simply opens toward it. The writer and philosopher Simone Weil spoke of attention as a form of generosity, of giving one's full presence to something or someone without the intrusion of one's own agenda. To give this kind of attention to the question of existence is to offer the question itself a kind of hospitality, to invite it in, to let it settle, to not rush it toward a conclusion it cannot honestly provide. And in that hospitality, something happens that is difficult to describe, but recognizable. A quality of openness, of spaciousness, of being, even briefly, released from the constriction of ordinary self-concern into something larger and quieter. It is fitting to end by returning to where we began, to the question itself, held lightly, without a demand for resolution. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question is still here. It has not been answered tonight, and there is no failure in that. The greatest minds across the centuries have met the same outcome, but perhaps it has been allowed to do what it does best, which is not to produce an answer, but to produce a certain quality of awareness. An awareness that existence is astonishing, that its presence is not guaranteed or obligatory or obvious, that every particular thing that exists, every star and stone and face and feeling, carries within it the quiet miracle of the fact that it is, rather than is not. The world is here. It has shown up, unbidden and inexplicably, and it has produced, among everything else it has produced, beings who can notice it and be moved by it and ask, with real curiosity and real wonder, why this should be so. And perhaps that noticing, that being moved, that asking, perhaps these are not merely secondary phenomena, riding on the surface of a physical world, but are themselves part of what existence is, the universe attending to itself, wondering at itself, finding itself here, and finding that remarkable. There is another dimension of this question worth exploring slowly, and it has to do with mathematics. One of the most striking features of the physical world is that it appears to be, at its deepest levels, mathematical in structure. This was noticed early in the history of science. Galileo wrote that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, and it has become, if anything, more rather than less striking as physics has developed. The equations that describe the behavior of subatomic particles, the curvature of space-time, the evolution of the early universe, these are structures of extraordinary mathematical elegance and precision. And they work. They make predictions that are confirmed by experiment to a degree of accuracy that has no parallel in any other domain of human knowledge. This fact that mathematics describes the physical world with such precision is itself a small mystery nested inside the larger mystery of existence. The physicist Eugene Wigner wrote a famous essay about what he called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. He was struck by the fact that mathematical structures developed by pure mathematicians with no practical applications in mind later turned out to describe physical reality with uncanny accuracy. The non-Euclidean geometry developed by Riemann in the 19th century, motivated by purely abstract mathematical curiosity, turned out to be exactly the geometry needed to describe the curvature of space-time in Einstein's general theory of relativity. The complex numbers that seemed, to mathematicians, like a purely formal construction, turned out to be indispensable to quantum mechanics. How does the mind-independent structure of mathematics manage to correspond so precisely to the mind-independent structure of physical reality? This question does not have a widely accepted answer, and it adds a further layer of wonder to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. Why is the something that exists so deeply mathematical? Why should the fabric of reality be written in the language of number and structure? Plato believed that mathematical objects, numbers, geometric forms, abstract relations, were more real than physical things. Physical things, in Plato's view, were imperfect and transient instantiations of eternal, unchanging, mathematical and ideal forms. The particular triangle drawn in sand was an imperfect copy of the ideal triangle, which existed not in physical space, but in a realm of pure intelligibility. The physical world was, for Plato, something of a shadow, real in its own way, but derivative, dependent on a deeper reality that was abstract and eternal. The question of why there is something rather than nothing would, in Plato's framework, partly become the question of why there is a physical world instantiating the mathematical forms, why the abstract gives rise to the concrete, why the ideal finds expression in the material. This is not a question that modern physicists typically ask, but it is not entirely disconnected from modern discussions either. The mathematical physicist Roger Penrose has argued in a series of books for what he calls three worlds and three mysteries. The three worlds are the physical world, the mental world, and the Platonic mathematical world, and the three mysteries are the relationships between them. How does the physical give rise to the mental? How does the mental come to know the mathematical? How does the mathematical give form to the physical? These three mysteries interlock and they all connect at their root to the question of why there is something rather than nothing. Because the answer to that question, if there is one, must somehow account for all three worlds and all three mysteries. The philosopher Gottlob Frege, who did foundational work in mathematical logic in the late 19th and early 20th century, held that numbers and logical objects exist independently of minds and of physical things. This view, sometimes called Platonism or mathematical realism, has been defended by many philosophers of mathematics since, including the 20th century philosopher Kurt Gödel, who combined rigorous mathematical work on the incompleteness of formal systems with a philosophical conviction that mathematical objects are genuinely real and are grasped by a faculty of mathematical intuition that is not reducible to ordinary sense perception. If mathematical objects exist independently of both minds and physical things, then the question of their existence is itself a version of the question of why there is something rather than nothing, extended now to include a realm that is neither physical nor mental, but abstract and eternal. These are very deep waters, and we are not required to reach the bottom of them tonight, but they gesture toward the scope of the question. The way in which asking why there is something rather than nothing quickly opens into connected questions about the nature of existence, the nature of mind, the nature of mathematics, and the relationships between all of these. It is a question that does not stay where it is put. It propagates through the whole of our understanding of reality, touching everything it encounters and leaving everything it touches slightly more mysterious and more wonderful than before. And perhaps this is, in the end, exactly right. The universe we inhabit is one whose deepest features remain genuinely puzzling to us, despite the extraordinary progress of science and philosophy over the past several centuries. We understand more than Leibniz did, more than Heidegger did, more than the ancient Greeks did. We have instruments that can observe the faintest light of the most distant galaxies. We have theories that describe the behavior of matter at energies and scales that are entirely beyond ordinary experience. We have mapped the human genome and begun to understand the molecular mechanisms of thought and feeling. And yet, the most fundamental question, why anything at all, remains as open as it ever was. Not frustratingly open, but wonderfully open. Open in the way that makes it possible to keep returning, to keep finding new angles, new perspectives, new companions in the inquiry, without ever exhausting what the question has to offer. The philosopher Bertrand Russell, who spent a long and productive life thinking about logic, mathematics, ethics, and the foundations of knowledge, said toward the end of his life that the greatest thing in human experience was not knowledge, but wonder. Not the satisfaction of having answered the question, but the quality of attention and openness that the question itself provoked. The willingness to not know, held not with anxiety, but with curiosity. This, Russell thought, was among the finest capacities of the human mind. To sit quietly with the question of why there is something rather than nothing is to exercise this capacity. It is to practice a kind of philosophical patience, not the impatience of wanting an answer quickly, but the patience of someone willing to let the question work on them over time, willing to be changed by the question, rather than simply seeking to use it as a vehicle for arriving at a predetermined conclusion. This kind of patience is rare, and it is worth cultivating. It creates a kind of spaciousness in the mind, a clearing where questions can live, without being immediately resolved, where mystery can be held without being made into a problem. And in that spaciousness, something settles. Not an answer, but something better than an answer. A sense of being at home in the question, of being comfortable with the depth and the openness of the world. A sense that it is all right to exist in a universe whose foundations you cannot fully explain, because existing in such a universe, being here, being aware, being able to notice and wonder, is itself already an extraordinary privilege. The something that exists includes you and your wondering, and this moment, and everything that has made this moment possible. And that, for now, is more than enough. Why is there something rather than nothing? The question remains. It will be here tomorrow, as it was here yesterday, as it was here for Leibniz and Heidegger and Wittgenstein and all the quiet thinkers who came before them. It asks nothing of you except occasionally, in a quiet moment, to take it out of your pocket, turn it over in the light, and notice how much you do not know, and how beautiful that not knowing can be.